I think the ship was built on Terra during the 22nd century, Gibson said calmly. The atomic wars during that period destroyed practically all historical records, along with the technology of the time, but I've read well-authenticated reports of atomic-driven ships leaving Terra before then for the nearer stars. The human race climbed out of its pit again during the 23rd century and developed the technology that gave us the ringwave. Certainly no atomic-powered ships were built after the wars. Our records are complete from that time. Farrell shook his head at the inference. I've read any number of fanciful romances on the theme, Gib, but it won't stand up in practice. No shipboard society could last through a 1,000-year space voyage. It's a physical and psychological impossibility. There's got to be some other explanation. Gibson shrugged. We can only eliminate the least likely alternatives and accept the simplest one remaining. Well, then we can eliminate this one now, Farrell said flatly. It entails a 1,000-year voyage, which is an impossibility for any gross reaction drive, the application of suspended animation or longevity or a successive generation program, and a final penetration of Hymenop-occupied space to set up a colony under the very antennae of the bees. Longevity wasn't developed until around the year 3000. Lee here was one of the first to profit by it, if you remember. And suspended animation is still to come, so there's one theory you can forget. Arthur's right, Stryker said reluctantly. An atomic-powered ship couldn't have made such a trip, Gib. And such a lineal descendant project couldn't have lasted through 40 generations, speculative fiction to the contrary. The later generations would have been too far removed in ideology and intent from their ancestors. They'd have adapted to shipboard life as the norm. They'd have atrophied physically, perhaps even have mutated. And they'd never have fought past the bees during the Hymenop invasion and occupation, Farrell finished triumphantly. The bees had better detection equipment than we had. They'd have picked this ship up long before it reached Alphard 6. But the ship wasn't here in 3000, Gibson said, and it is now. Therefore, it must have arrived at some time during the 200 years of Hymenop occupation and evacuation. Farrell, tangled in contradictions, swore bitterly. But why should the bees let them through? The 3 domes on 5 are over 200 years old, which means that the bees were here before the ship came. Why didn't they blast it or enslave its crew? We haven't touched on all the possibilities, Gibson reminded him. We haven't even established yet that these people were never under Hymenop control. Precedent won't hold always, and there's no predicting nor evaluating the motives of an alien race. We never understood the Hymenops because there's no common ground of logic between us. Why try to interpret their intentions now? Farrell threw up his hands in disgust. Next you'll say this is an ancient Terran expedition that actually succeeded. Well, there's only one way to answer the questions we've raised, and that's to go down and see for ourselves. Ready, Xav? But uncertainty nagged uneasily at him when Farrell found himself alone in the helihopper, with the forest flowing beneath like a leafy river, and Xavier's scouter disappearing bullet-like into the dusk ahead. We never found a colony so advanced, Farrell thought. Suppose this is a Hymenop experiment that really paid off. The bees did some weird and wonderful things with human guinea pigs. What if they created the ultimate booby trap here and primed it with conditioned myrmidons in our own form? Suppose, he thought, and derided himself for thinking of it, suppose one of those suicidal old interstellar ventures did succeed. Xavier's voice, a mellow drone from the helihopper's ringwave-powered Visicom, cut sharply into his musing. The ship has discovered the scouter and is training an electronic beam upon it. My instruments record an electromagnetic vibration pattern of low power but rapidly varying frequency. The operation seems pointless. Stryker's voice followed, querulous with worry. "I'd better pull Zave back. It may be something lethal." "Don't," Gibson's baritone advised. Surprisingly, there was excitement in the engineer's voice. I think they're trying to communicate with us." Farrell was on the point of demanding acidly to know how one went about communicating by means of a fluctuating electric field when the unexpected cessation of forest diverted his attention. The helihopper scudded over a cultivated area of considerable extent, fields stretching below in a vague, random checkerboard of lighter and darker earth, an undefined cluster of buildings at their center. There was a central bonfire that burned like a wild red eye against the lower gloom, and in its plunging ruddy glow he made out an urgent scurrying of shadowy figures. "I'm passing over a hamlet," Farrell reported. "The one nearest the city, I think. There's something odd going on down." Catastrophe struck so suddenly that he was caught completely unprepared. The helihopper's flimsy carriage bucked and crumpled. There was a blinding flare of electric discharge, a pungent stink of ozone, and a stunning shock that flung him headlong into darkness. He awoke slowly with a brutal headache and a conviction of nightmare heightened by the outlandish tone of his surroundings. He lay on a narrow bed in a whitely antiseptic infirmary, an oblong metal cell cluttered with a grimly utilitarian array of tables and lockers and chests. The lighting was harsh and overbright, and the air hung thick with pungent, unfamiliar chemical odors. From somewhere far off, yet at the same time as near as the bulkhead above him, came the unceasing drone of machinery. Farrell sat up, groaning, when full consciousness made his position clear. He had been shot down by God knew what sort of devastating, unorthodox weapon, and was a prisoner in the grounded ship. At his rising, a white-smocked fat man with anachronistic spectacles and close-cropped gray hair came into the room, moving with the professional assurance of a medic. The man stopped short at Farrell's stare and spoke. His words were utterly unintelligible, but his gesture was unmistakable. Farrell followed him dumbly out of the infirmary and down a bare corridor whose metal floor rang coldly underfoot. An open port near the corridor's end relieved the blankness of wall and let in a flood of reddish Alphardian sunlight. Farrell slowed to look out, wondering how long he had lain unconscious, and felt panic knife at him when he saw Xavier Scouter lying, port open and undefended, on the square outside. The mechanical had been as easily taken as himself, then. Stryker and Gibson, for all their professional caution, would fare no better. They could not have overlooked the capture of Farrell and Xavier, and when they tried, as a matter of course, to rescue them, the Marco would be struck down in turn by the same weapon.